welcome to another episode of the Sforim Chatter Podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored anonymously in honor and in support of the Sforim Chatter Podcast. To sponsor an episode of the podcast, you can email me sforimchatter@gmail.com, and you can also Zelle that email address, or you can check out the link and information in the show notes below. You can also find the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Sforim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sforim, book deals, and so on. You could also subscribe to the Sforim Chatter WhatsApp status if you prefer that. And also, if you can please subscribe to the podcast, rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. Finally, I want to mention a new program that I'm working on here on Sforim Chatter, which is called Footnotes, which will be kind of a reaction, feedback, replies type of episode. It will be sporadically every once in a while. So if anyone has any feedback and they would like me to address that on this episode, please email me, sforimchatter@gmail.com. You can also WhatsApp me if you're on the WhatsApp chat. And if you would like me to say your name and where you're from, please write that in your email or in your WhatsApp. And so looking forward to receiving various messages and seeing how that goes. And so with that, enjoy this week's 9 days, 3 weeks themed episode about Emek Habacha and the historian Yosef HaKohen. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Sforim Chatter Podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Dr. Micha Perry, who is professor of medieval Jewish history at the University of Haifa. And on this episode, we're going to be discussing Yosef HaKohen, the 16th century Jewish historian, and mainly focused on his Sefer Emek Habacha. Also, he wrote another larger history work, which we'll discuss as well, Divrei Yamim L'Malchei Tzarfas U'Malchei Beis Ottoman. But we will focus on the Emek Habacha, which is appropriate for this time of year. It's a sad book of the unfortunate events of Jewish history. And we'll talk a little bit about this book. And there's a new edition that Dr. Perry was involved in, that Professor Reuven Bonfil published through Magnus Press. Actually, 3 volumes of the Divrei Yamim, critical edition, 1 volume Emek Habacha, and then also a historical novel, historical fiction, you will, of the historian Yosef HaKohen. So thank you, Dr. Perry, for joining me once again.
It's a pleasure, Nachman. Thank you very much to be here.
So how did you come to be involved with the Emek Habacha and with Yosef HaKohen's works?
So Professor Robert Bonfil is, he's a renowned historian of the Renaissance, among other things, but mainly of the Renaissance, and he has a special interest in historical writings in the 16th century. Maybe we could talk about the Yerushalmi later, but that's as well. And I was his student, and I came to know him through this project. He was looking for a research assistant, and somebody at the National Library put him in touch with me. And I started working for him. This is how I got to know him, basically. And as an undergraduate, I worked on this project. He worked on it for 40 years. I came at the tail of it, really at the end of it. And what I had to do was to compare the manuscripts of Emek Habacha to the printed edition and the additions that Yosef HaKohen put on it. We'll talk about it in a moment, to see if there's any changes. So I worked on this, I think, for 2 years, and ever since I've been involved in the project, trying to push Bonfil forward to publish it, and he did a remarkable work. And for me, this was incredible training, really, training of philology, of historical working, and I feel blessed to have the opportunity to take part in this project, really. My formation as an historian came through working on this project, even if I don't deal in the 16th century or in historiography.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's a tremendous job. I mean, what happened here, the new edition with endless, really the footnotes, and it just covers so much, as we'll get to, because we're going to discuss Yosef HaKohen's sources and it's just, for anyone that sees the work will see it. So, okay, let's start off with a little bit that we know. Obviously, as I mentioned, Professor Bonfil wrote a historical novel, so there's not that much known to write a history book, but there is obviously some that we know. So what do we know of Yosef HaKohen? Tell the listeners, who was this man, this historian? Because that's really what he was, this historian. When was he born? Where did he live? What do we know about him?
So before I tell you what we know about him, I'll tell you how do we know about it. So our main source of knowledge about Yosef HaKohen is his own writing. And he somehow, within his book of history, he put some personal notes. In this year, I got married. In that year, my son was born. In this year, my daughter passed away, etc. So he has these autobiographical notes as part of the world history embedded into his work. Beside that, we have some external sources, other writings that he wrote, some letters, a contract that he signed off, Very little. So Yosef Cohen comes from a family of exiles from Spain. They come from the family probably came from central Spain, and his parents were expelled from Spain and went to southern France. On their séjour at Avignon, at southern France, he was born. And by the age of 9, they continued their traveling and got to Italy and settled around Genoa, where he worked. He had an elder sister, Clara, who he got into a fight later in his life with. And this is the contract that we have, um, um, cutting their money in half. And so he was a physician, probably taught by his father, and he served as a physician in Genoa. He lived in Genoa and around the area of Genoa most of his life, but the Jews were expelled. He married the daughter of a rabbi from Bologna, Avraham Cohen. Avraham Cohen was himself an exile from Spain, so this is though they're in Italy, both of them are from the same milieu, social milieu. They come from the same roots. We know the name of his wife, Paloma, a dove, basically. And he had the three boys and daughter. Two of them passed away. He wrote this book, sort of took him 20 years or so when he started. He published it in his daily life in 1553. He was expelled from Genoa. He moved to Reggio, a small town outside of Genoa, and later on he moved to even a smaller town, a tiny town up in the mountains called Castello de Monefera, where he probably ended his life. Some sources said that he went back to Genoa and he died there at 1572 or 3. That's what we know about his life. And beside this book, he wrote other books. One about medicine, another is a model letters, which a lot of young people in Italy used to do, and also some information about the Americas, sort of this new world that he also tried to mediate to his Jewish readers.
Yeah, that was something that I know Rabbi Avram Farisol at the time was doing as well. Others were writing in Italy, so that was an the Americas was an interesting place for them, of course, the New World. So, how did he become a historian? As you mentioned, he was a physician. We don't know much about him, but he wrote this massive history, and we should talk about Divrei Yamim and what it is, what he did there, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time on Emek Habacha. But what did he do, as a historian? How did he? I think also tell us how unique was it that there was a historian, a Jewish historian, in the 16th century?
So Yosef Cohen thinks that it's extremely unique, and he says, since Josephus, Jews stopped writing history. Ad shekamti ani, until I stood up and I took the helm and started writing again history, world history. He doesn't tell us much about his motivations, beside his aspiration to tell what happened to the people of Israel, so to educate the people. But he was a historian at heart. There was an assumption that he had a messianic tendency to him, and this is why he wrote history. This was put forward mainly by Yerushalmi, others basing themselves on a Kabbalistic manuscript that he copied, thought that he was a Kabbalist, and from here he had messianic Kabbalistic tendencies. Bonfield discharged these claims. He says we have no proof of that. He's extremely rationalist, and for Bonfield, it's an anomaly that he copied that Kabbalistic manuscript. It could be that he was paid for it. It could be that he was young. It could be he was a Kabbalist and interested in it. But his motivation in writing history are to tell the world the history of the Jews, sort of, and to tell the Jews the history of the world. And he sees himself as the first one that stood after Josephus. Obviously, this is not true. We had other historians, especially in the 16th century, and we had also medieval historians.
But that's how he viewed himself. And he wrote in Hebrew, so he was writing for Jews, but he was writing not only, the Emek Habacha is Jewish history, of the sad kind for Jews, but Divrei Hayamim, as I said, it's Divrei Hayamim l'malchei Tzarfat u'malchei Beit Ottoman. So this is a French and Turkish history. This is not a Jewish history per se. So he was writing, as you say, world history and then Emek Habacha Jewish history. So he was writing both for a Jewish audience, essentially.
So we don't know if he from the get-go wanted to write Emek Habacha. Obviously, he started with Divrei Hayamim. Divrei Hayamim is the history. This is the title of the book: the history of the kings of France and the Ottomans. Now we have to say we're in the 16th century. Luckily for me, I'm a medievalist. I don't have to deal with the 16th century, because your head will spin. Anybody who deals with the 16th century, this is a time of transformation, the print, the discovery of the Americas, and we have these huge, very strong figures. In Turkey, you have Suleiman the Magnificent. In France, you have François Premier. In Germany and Italy, you have Karl V, who reigned over Spain, Germany, and Mexico. This is the first king that they say that the sun never sets in his kingdom, because it's either in Mexico or in Spain. Always is there. We have Magellan. We have Henry VIII. We have Philip II. We have Martin Luther. We have David Reuveni and Shlomo Molcho. We could talk about this. We have the Protestant movement, the discovery of Americas. This is a huge time of change, and people were fascinated with the news because news were happening at last.
And so in comes Yosef Cohen and he decides he's going to write history. He's going to, I mean, maybe this is why he decides to do it, but he's going to write history for the Jews. And as you alluded to, Emek Habacha is, although we have a manuscript from it, it's taken from Divrei Hayamim. He essentially writes Divrei Hayamim, and then we have Emek Habacha. So you don't know if he, along the way, realized, you know what, I should also create a book separately, even though once I have the material of just Jewish history.
So the novelty of Divrei Hayamim is that it combines what we call today general history and Jewish history. And they're woven together, and they're put together. And some of the paragraphs, he also tries to combine the story. This king conquered that city, and then he expelled the Jews, and then he killed the Jews over there, and there was a massacre. So he tries to combine it, and this is, I think, one of the greatest novelties of this book, the Divrei Hayamim, the story of the kings, where he tries to combine Jewish history and non-Jewish history. He wrote this for a generation, and he gathered material. He published it in his lifetime. And then he continues working on it. At the end of the lifetime, he decides to take out all, and this is fascinating. We don't have an explanation exactly why, but there is a theory. He takes out all the paragraphs dealing with Jews, and he puts them in a separate manuscript. This was not published in his lifetime, but it was probably copied. And he said, I put this in a book. If you read the beginning of Emek Habacha, I want this so people will read it and weep. That's why he calls it the Valley of Tears. He wants people to read it and weep. This was not published in print in his lifetime. This was only published in the 19th century as a separate book. There's one theory that Bonfield raises, that he's done this so it will be ritually read on Tisha B'Av, and he shows that there was a custom among Italian Jews to read sort of like Echa, like Lamentations, to read sad historical stories, and this could have been the uses of the Emek Habacha to be read during Tisha B'Av after Echa, and Shadal, Shlomo David Luzzati, who wrote a bit about it, says that yes, we had this custom among Italian Jews before that. But there could be another reason, and that is Divrei Hayamim is huge. It's huge, and I know from medieval times that huge manuscripts aren't copied, only smaller, slim books. So maybe he had an economic reason as well, to take out only the Jewish history and to try and sell that. He didn't publish it.
And the new Bonfield edition of Emek Habacha is just over 200 pages, whereas the Divrei Yamim is 3 big volumes. So it's definitely much more. I think it's worth, you mentioned it. I should read it for the listeners just to hear how he starts off. Yes, we're going to Emek Habacha, and it's very poignant and it's very sad. And this is 3 weeks, and this is coming out, so this is kind of appropriate. Where he says, Amar Yosef ben Yeshua ben Meir ben Yehuda ben Yeshua ben Yehuda ben David ben Moshe ben Akoyanim Sheyatzu mi Jueti me'eretz Farad. So he's giving his whole yichus. He's kind of going through everything. Liyos ketloyos asher avro aleinu miyam galus Yehuda me'alad masa adayam eseh. Everything that came over us, Mefuzares Hein Ve'ena, we're all spread out, all the Jews, all different places. Nasati alibi, I put it in my heart, lachabram bechibar katan. I wanted to put it together in a small work. So you see, he's definitely, he's intending to put it together. Yichlal, right, to include es asher matze yadi bekuntresi hasoifrim, the stories that are kasfu lefanai beloshin ivri ubesifrehem. And in there, so in Jewish books and non-Jewish books. Ve'ekra shemai, and I called it Emek Habacha. Why? He says, Ki kashmai kenu, its name is how it is. V'chala kairiboy, everyone who reads it, Yasum v'yishuv yachad v'afafoyev yezlu mayim, you're going to cry, v'yasim yadav al chalotzav loimar, and you're going to say, Ad masay Hashem, Hashem, until when? Eleki eschanon yismu yamei avleinu, v'yishlach matzir tzidkenu, Yigalenu b'meherav yamenu laman racham of a chazad of amen v'amen. He says, Hashem, please send us Mashiach. Crying. This is all the bad things that happened to us. And then he starts off just the book. Vayhi, and so it was. Acharei tzeis Yerushalayim kol hadara v'yasher titos melech roi roimim. So he goes right in to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and what happened. And he right away starts off with with the worst day in Jewish history, and then he just keeps going up until his time. And that's really what the book is.
Right. So it's what Salo Baron called the lachrymose history, a theory of unfortunate events. You might call it as well.
Yeah.
And maybe here is a place to mention Chaim Yosef Yerushalmi's, the great historian from Colombia's theory in his little book called Zachor, because the opening that you read does hint to some kind of messianic aspiration. We should bring this to the Messiah. And Yerushalmi in that book, it's a beautiful book. I recommend everybody to read it. It's very short. You take an hour and read it. It's a book that influenced historians and non-historians around. And that book, the whole talks about how difficult it is to be a modern Jewish historian writing history, because you are writing in a form and in a content about something that you detached. Because Jewish memory was not writing professional history. It was living history through the Pesach Seder and through Lamentation, etc. So in a way, Chaim Yerushalmi, in that book, he laments the fact that modern historians write about something that by writing on it, they're detaching themselves from the lived experience. Now, he has a problem with that little book, and that is that we have quite a few Jewish historians that did write professional history. And maybe chief among them would be Josephus, and later on, Yosef HaKohen. So he had to explain and there's other historians, Tzemach David in the 16th century, and Shoshet HaKabbalah, and others. So he has to say all these writers, except Josephus, writing in the 16th century, they are writing because they had a messianic tendency. So it's not real historiography as we would write today. And Bonfield actually, working on these, historians objected to that notion, to all these notions, claiming that basically, and we might remind everybody that Bonfield is an Orthodox rabbi, and he said Jews don't have a tale. Jews write history like the non-Jews. They do everything like the non-Jews. So if non-Jews write history in a certain way, Jews do it the same way. In the Middle Ages, they wrote in through myth and through stories. In the 16th century, they write through sort of these positivistic historical writing, just like the Christians do. And there's nothing unique about it. But so I'm not sure there's something messianic about this book. It is something that follow the models that non-Jews do at the same time. Not only does it follow the model, it basically translates their work into Hebrew.
And just to add to that, turning all the way to the end of the book and how he ends the book, because I think it's appropriate to, connect that to what you just said. He says, Amar Yosef Rabbi Yeshua Kohen Zal. Avarech Has Hashem, I give blessing, thanks to God. Asher Yatzeni, he gave me the advice. Lachaber Sachiber Akatan said the small work. Hakoilel that includes Roy Vatlois, most of the Vahamehumois, Asher Avru Aleinu, the sad things, the unfortunate events that happened to us, Miyam Achurban Adayam Ezeh, from the Churban Beis Hamikdash until today. Kasher Asiga Yodi Zersham, like I found different places. Vatiyash Lamasai, and it was ending B'Yam Chof Aleph Tammuz Shin Lamed Hey. Kain Yazreini Hashem Beracham of Tamid. So Hashem should help me in His great mercy. V'yazakeni, and I should be zoicha lichtov bias hagol. I should be merit to write the coming of Messiah, coming of Mashiach, the Geula. V'yakimanu pasuk, and we should have the pasuk. Sisu atam Messiah's kolam asablim aleh. Everyone should rejoice. Those that mourn the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. V'yishalmu yemei avleinu, and we should v'yishalmu avleinu amen v'amen, amen v'amen. We should have finished off all our mourning. So you see that he is definitely coming, whether it's Messianic, and he's saying definitely, Mashiach should come. We should have enough of the suffering, enough of the mourning, the galus, and we should go back and we should, see the Beis Hamikdash. That's definitely, and he should be zeicha to write the history of Mashiach coming, is what he's saying.
Okay, so absolutely. Nevertheless, he writes a realistic, positivistic history. The ideal of historical writing from antiquity was what they called in Latin sine ira non studio, without fear and without prejudice. And if you'll join me on page 178, you see where there's a moment of reflection, a beautiful letter that he integrated. So there was a persecution of the Jews, and in 1558, and he claims that two Jews were at fault here and bringing the Dominicans into the Jewish world, and talking something bad about the Talmud. And one of them was called Joseph Ontolego, who was probably Ashkenazic or something, that brought over there. And he published Ontolego's this accusation that because of Joseph Ontolego's behavior, the monks burned the Talmud. And Ontolego was apparently furious and blaming him. So in Emek Habacha, he puts in a letter that he wrote to Yosef Ontolego, and he said in that letter, "Listen, I heard that you're accusing me of blaming you in this. So you should know that I don't slander. I said, I spoke the truth, and I didn't. I have no fear to talk. הביטה והראה שגם עם מלכים ויוצאי ארץ דיברתי כל אשר קרא להם כדרך הארץ עם טוב ועם רע. I spoke against kings, King Henry VIII. I spoke against counts. I fear nobody. I said only the truth. And we are not less from there. And even more of that, by mentioning your name will stay in the books for eternity. You should thank me. There's no bad publicity as long as you spell his name right. So basically, you have the same ideal of sine ira non studio, of no fear and no prejudice. I give nobody any slack. Everybody is treated the same, and this is the historical ideal that is unfamiliar in Jewish world till then.
So I think we've talked a little bit why we think he wrote it in some examples. We'll give more from Emek Habacha, but let's take a step back for a second and tell the listeners. So why an overview of Emek Habacha? Obviously it's more or less sad. He's writing the travails of Jewish history that befall the Jewish people. But what exactly is the book? What if you can give the overview of the book? And like we said, he starts off with Titus leaving Yerushalayim, right. And where does it end? And what's the scope of the book?
So first of all, we have to be reminded that Emek Habacha is less than 15% from Divrei Emek. I think around 15%, 14, something like that. When Phil did the math, it's seen as introduction. So, as you read the first paragraph, he starts with Titus and the destruction of Bet HaMikdash. But very soon after, he moves to the Bar Kokhba revolt and skips fast forward to the Middle Ages. And almost half of the book is what we know about the persecution of the Jews during the Middle Ages. The other half would be almost things that happened in the 16th century in his lifetime, from the expulsion of Spain onward, up to the point where he's telling things that actually happened to him when he was expelled from Genoa, and when his child died, or when he fought with this Joseph Ontolegi. So that's more or less the preview of the whole book. So it starts with the big events. The more that it goes close to his own lifetime, even small events become significant and are mentioned.
We mentioned this also, but to emphasize, what is his viewpoint as a Jew writing in exile? He's in exile. He's in Italy. His family has been exiled from Spain, right? And his wife's family. And then he gets exiled from Genoa. What's that like for him? How does that come across throughout the book?
There's something a bit, I'm not sure I could answer that, but there's something a bit depressing about reading his tone. Yes. And the more that he gets into his own lifetime, you see the disputations among the Jews themselves, sort of the cause of our weakness. And this is a sad view. Sort of, he's accusing the victims themselves in a way. If we would have been better behaved, if we would have learned the Torah better, etc., etc. So, on one hand, you get this lachrymose history, meaning we're in exile and will always be forever persecuted. But also, we, the Jewish people, are not living our full potential. We are not up to par for the Messiah, for the Mashiach to come. In a way, that's the gist of it. But it's really on a informal, informative level. He gives information more or less, and this is what we call a positivistic historian. He says what happened. This happened. This happened. That's all.
I mean, that's something that, you hear that refrain from other writers, and obviously, go back to Chazal, go back to Gemara, where they say, Sinas Chinam destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, and they're talking about, Jews themselves fighting. So you see him saying this also. So we mentioned that really a lot of, Emek Habacha was a separate manuscript, but it was taken from Divrei Yamim. So is everything in Emek Habacha in Divrei Yamim, or is there anything that he added unique to Emek Habacha that's not in Divrei Yamim?
Everything is in, but not in the printed edition. Everything is in. So what happened is that the book was printed in his lifetime in 1553 in Saviota. There's another print later, after his lifetime, and he had a copy that he continued to update, and he put pages within, or he wrote some additions on the margins, but basically everywhere he wanted to add something, he found new books. So he put a page within the print and added something, and we have this copy. There's one in JDS. I worked off a photograph of that. So everything that's in Emek Habacha also appears in Divrei Yamim, or in his additions to Divrei Yamim. But there is information in both of these books that is unique to Yosef HaKohen, that doesn't appear in any other historical books. And that's mainly the things that he tells about his lifetime. Some of them are collaborated from exterior sources. For example, the expulsion of the Jews from Genoa that he actually underwent, or his father. And we could find the edict that the Duchy of Genoa published. Others are not. For example, the story with Ontolegi. We don't know what happened with the Dominican monks in the Talmud. We don't know exactly what happened there. He's the only source for that story.
I don't know if there's any other examples you want to give, but overall, as you mentioned, and some have said, and Shadal, who was the, we know he was the Magia, he got a copy of this, and he said that they said they would read this in Italy, Tishbav. It is definitely a sad read, and it's something that you could read about starting from the Churban, and he talks about the expulsion of the Jews from England, the expulsion of the Jews from France, and all the expulsions, all the sad things that are happening to Jews, all the horrible events like the burning of the Talmud in his day. So certainly it's unfortunately appropriate reading for the 3 weeks, I think one would say.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's a sad read. It's and he says, we should lament. We should cry about this issue, and fulfill Bonfield portrays him as at the end of his life as a very sad person that didn't accomplish everything that he did that he wanted to do. He was cut off from his family, from his library, from big Jewish centers. He found himself somewhere in a very small village in the mountains. So maybe it's a personal perspective as well. Um, so, for example, but he got very he was very he admired Shlomo Molcho. Story the Shlomo Molcho, David Reuveni was a Jew who came from the east somewhere uh, and claimed to be a Jewish king, and he tried to convince the Pope and the King of Portugal to give him arms so he could defeat the Arabs. And when he was in Portugal, he met this Christian from Jewish origin monk called Diego Pires, who became his follower and also sort of his prophet, Shlomo Molcho. And Yosef Cohen does not admire Reuveni so much, but he does admire Shlomo Molcho. Sort of. So if you want to look at this from this angle, he admires more the Kabbalist, spiritual leader, writer, author, magician, more than the political king, army man, self-proclaimed Messiah, maybe.
So I think we should discuss the sources that Yosef Cohen uses in Divrei Yamim or Emek Habacha. And I keep calling them two books, even though, as we said, they're really the same kind of Emek Habacha taken out of it. Divrei Yamim, we'll call two separate. So what can you say about the sources that he used?
So I think this is extremely important, and also it lights the addition that Bonfield did. The most important thing with you deal with historiography are the sources, and see the changes from the sources. So a good edition should give you all the sources that the author used, and if you compare this edition to other editions of historiographies, even Gershon David Cohen's Sefer HaKabbalah, where he found many of the sources, but also if you compare it to David Gantz's Tzemach David, where the editors only marked, the psukim in the Mikra, where he said, Bonfield did a remarkable job here. He didn't identify all the sources, but what he did identify is remarkable. So Yosef Cohen uses printed books that he knew of. And there's almost nothing original in what he's telling. Everything could almost be tracked down to to um, printed books, non-Jewish and Jewish. In the Jewish case, he uses Josephus, and then he uses, for example, all the history written about 1096 about Tatnu, if it's Ephraim from Bonn Chronicles and other chronicles, but mainly uses also Shmuel Uske, who published in Portuguese a book about the constellation, about the tribulates of Israel. In the non-Jewish case, he uses historical books, many of them. He had a vast library. On top of all these that Bonfield discovered them, really went back to each one of them and could compare what the source said, and he gives you the original language, what the source said, and how Yosef changed it. In the 16th century, we have what we could title the beginning of journalism. It's not exactly newspapers, but what happened if you were in Venice? Somebody came in the ports and they had some news about a war, a battle, a new country, and you had these publishers who published one-pagers, a page with this information, and they printed it. Sometimes they had a source within the palace of the king who gave them information, and they published that. And these were called notices, in Italian, avvisi. And apparently, Yosef Cohen was exposed to these, and he used them. So this is really, fresh out of print. For the Jewish world, worldwide, this is things that just came out from the port. The last news about the battle between King Henry and Francois or the new country discovered just south of Haiti or Brazil or something. This was fascinating, and most of these pages disappeared. But remarkably, Bonfil did find many of them. He claims not all of them, but what he did find is remarkable. I remember I studied in Paris, and he sent me to the National Library in Paris to look for one of these. And I found it, and I photocopied it, and I copied it and sent it to him via mail to him. It had no use. It's not one of those that you see. And he saw hundreds, not thousands of these that had no use for this edition. But he did find a lot that did have relevance to this edition, and it sort of show you this historical of its own time. And I think this is part of the most interesting work of Yosefa Cohen, sort of an actual historian that tells and writes the history of his own time. It's fascinating, this, and Bonfil's work in this regard is remarkable, really remarkable. And this is why it took 40 years. And as he says in the edition, luckily he had to send it to print before AI and Google took over, because probably now we would have found a lot more of this stuff.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation about how we can use AI and all those sources later to find those sources, use those, technology to help find, especially such out there sources. And you're just flipping through the edition, you can see all the different. You see it. It comes out. The notes are in Hebrew, the footnotes, Bonfeld's footnotes, but you have other languages that he puts in there where Yosef Cohen was coming from other languages, and you can see where he's coming from. And you still kept it in the Latin or whatever it was. It still has that in the text as well. So really, really fascinating. Definitely. So,
but for example, in this case, Yosef Cohen wrote another book. That was titled that was titled the Book of the New India and Fernando Cortes, for example. This is a translation of Francisco de Gomara's book about the Americas, and this is information that Jews didn't have till that time. This was really at Yosef Cohen's time. This was really new out of print, and he mitigated it to a larger public, a Jewish public that could read it. And and all these, we center here about Emek Habacha, because this is Jewish history, and you're so right to say this is, Rosh Hashanah and Sfirat HaOmer, this is the time to read it. But I think Jews at the time were much more interested in non-Jewish history, and Joseph Cohen gave them that, and he gave it in a very, you might say, even telenovela fashion. The kings are always they're angry, or they fall in love, or they have these motivations. Very emotional, the whole thing. So history for him is a good story, a vivid story. And the dead, is remarkable. And so just one thing I need to add in this work of meditating non-Jewish scholarship or history to Jews, he also is one of the first people to write in Hebrew about the new inventions of the time: cannons, um, gunpowder, rifles, Eilim HaMenachim. Cannons are Eilim Menachim, right? So he has all this terminology that he came up to tell about these stories. Okay.
the print history of Emek Habacha. As you mentioned, Divrei Yamin was published in his lifetime, and it was published again. But Emek Habacha was not published until the 19th century. So when discussing, let's discuss the print history of Emek Habacha.
So it was printed in Germany by somebody called Letris. This is interesting because Letris, as a family name, is originally from southern France, from the region of Avignon, where Yosef Cohen was born. I don't know if it has any relevance, but it's interesting. But he was a Polish Jew who came to Germany and published many scholarly works. He was in touch with Shmuel David Luzzatto, who was the head of the rabbinic seminar in Milano, I think. Milano or Padua?
Padua.
Padua, right. And Shadad sent him this manuscript with his own remarks at the margin as well. He also added some remarks on the names and people what it was, and Let's printed it. Since then, it was printed a couple of times later again, but that's the main edition. And you told me it has a English translation. Maybe you want to. It was translated into French, into Latin, into other languages. Um, how about the English translation?
So there is an English translation called The Veil of Tears, Emek Habacha, translated plus critical commentary by Harry S. May, and it actually calls it Joseph Cohen, the anonymous corrector. And there's a short introduction, and then there's a translation with some sources. So if anyone wants to read it in English, I will say that the translator there, this Harry May, does say that it wasn't like a literal translation, and he kind of tries to explain himself why he didn't do a literal translation. He says that and writing this quote unquote free modern translation is what he calls it. And he explains why he did so, etc. So I will say it's not, the literal, but it is some sort of English translation that I'll link to that on Amazon. I'll link to the 3 volumes, Yosef Cohen of Professor Bonfil. I'll link to the new edition, the new beautiful edition of Emek Habacha from Magnus, as well as his historical fiction novel, Chai Yosef, I think. And I will say Magnus, which is Hebrew University's press, they do ship to America. For those interested, you can use that link. You can order. I don't know shipping prices, but they do ship. You can order from them. Not all Israeli prices. You can order from them. And also, I'll link also to Zachar in the show's notes. You mentioned Professor Yerushalmi. Zachar, I'll put that in the show's notes as well for anybody interested in checking that out as well. So
I'll send you also a response article by Bonfil to Zechor.
Okay, great. That I will add that to the notes as well. So, just in closing, what would you say the legacy of Yosef Cohen and specifically Emek Habacha is?
So, Emek Habacha, as you mentioned, was not published until the 19th century, and I think it's not coincidental. It was printed in the bosom of the Wissenschaft zum Judentum, the rise of new academic learning of Judaism. And at first, these German Jewish scholars, somebody claimed the myth said that they want to bury Judaism, give it a nice burial. They did all this philological work and to put it to rest. And in that vein, Yerushalmi as a whole continues the same thing. He says, as a secular historian, I go against the grain of Jewish experience. And in a way, I think that Bonfil, as a modern historian, extremely sophisticated, one of the excellent Jewish historians of the 21st century, and as an Orthodox rabbi, and also as somebody who lives a full Jewish experience, I think putting back Yosef Cohen at the center and saying this is a Jewish work. This is the way that Jewish memory worked as well. This is not an anomaly. This is part of how we think and how we work. And there shouldn't be this split between Jewish history and non-Jewish history. What do we think, that God does not work in non-Jewish history, he only works in Jewish history? So I think the heritage of this is, yes, 16th century Jews wrote professional history, and they were 100% Jewish, with a very strong Jewish identity. Nevertheless, they were professional historians, just like their neighbors.
And, as we said, anyone that wants to, especially for this time of year, read something historical about the sad events. I know you're saying it was a positivist view of history, but at the end of the day, a sad, Emek Habacha, as Yosef Cohen says, you'll read something and cry and see what happened in Jewish history. I think Emek Habacha is a worthy read in that sense.
I'll just add, you said it very nicely. I think reading this 2 years ago, when it was published first, I think we said, now we could sit in the state of Israel, here in Jerusalem, we sit and read this differently. And somehow, something in all of us sort of was shattered in the past year and a half. So I really want to end in hope that, all the hostages will come back and this horrible war will end and we'll find peace for Jews and non-Jews alike everywhere.
Amen. And so, thank you, Dr. Perry, for joining me once again.